Welcome. This is Jan Spencer coming to you from Eugene, Oregon. You are watching the YouTube version of the radio program, Creating a Preferred Future. My guest today is Mark Robinowitz. But before we meet Mark, let me share a few words about the radio program. Creating a Preferred Future is all about taking action at home, the neighborhood, the community, and beyond, for creating a society and economic system that fits within the boundaries of the natural world, and where society's goal is to bring out the best and positive human potential. You can find podcasts from previous episodes and links to related YouTube videos on my website, suburbanpermaculture.org. Look for the media tab. Previous episodes have described 22 years transforming a suburban property, urban eco-villages, mindful economics, empowering young people, pushing back on cars, permaculture, critique of capitalism and the consumer culture, and how to pay for the changes. All the content is intended to encourage taking action in one's home, neighborhood, community, and beyond for creating a preferred future. Okay, that's good. Next, I'd like to introduce Mark. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Jan.
I want to just say a few things about you, and then we'll get into our conversation, our interview. Mark lives just outside of Eugene. We've been friends for over 20 years. Mark has a keen interest in permaculture, and he produces a useful amount of energy, electricity, and food on his own rural property. He's got a deep interest in current events, energy, and transportation issues. His website, peakchoice.org, is a treasure trove of documents, statistics, graphics, and his own writings explaining why our society and world has an urgent need to downsize energy and resource use and needs, and to learn how to cooperate in common cause and make best of useful existing economic production capacity to prepare for a far more constrained future. So we'll hear how Mark went through his own one-way door, his thought on fossil and renewable energy, geopolitics, transportation, permaculture, and more. Mark, welcome to Creating a Preferred Future.
Thanks, Jan. Where would you like to start our exploration?
Okay, I have a question ready for you. Please tell us a bit about your growing up and your background. How did you find your way into these critical issues about energy, resources, and permaculture?
I've always been interested in how things work. And one of the earlier memories I have of the role of energy in our lives was in 1973, when there were gas lines at the gas stations of America. Not that I was driving yet, I'm not quite that old, but I remember sitting in my mom's car while we waited for an hour just to be able to purchase gasoline. Didn't understand the implications of this, but it got my attention. Another example, when I was 15, the 3 Mile Island reactor near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, had a partial meltdown. And I went from being mildly interested in nuclear power to being extremely alarmed, as the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had predicted a few years prior, an area the size of Pennsylvania could be rendered uninhabitable, that's a verbatim quote, if there was a meltdown. Fortunately, it wasn't the worst case scenario, but it was a lesson to our society that wanting too much energy can cause major consequences that no one can possibly prepare for. In college, Ronald Reagan was president. And I realized we have plans for a nuclear war, despite the obvious insanity of it. Hydrogen bombs are on missiles, waiting for the command to be launched across the world and wipe out millions, if not billions of people. And we have all gotten used to this. It came out more than a decade later that in 1983, we came very close to having a nuclear war through suspicion, accident, and I want to recommend a Google term. Stanislav Petrov was a Soviet warning officer who, when given a false alarm that the Americans had started a war, refused to notify his superiors, so-called. There's a documentary film about him called The Man Who Saved the World. So at that time, I went through what I call a one-way door, where you learn too much and you can't unlearn what you've learned. And this can apply to nuclear, it can apply to climate change, it can apply to all sorts of problems in the world that can be easily ignored in our daily lives, where none of this is the way that we are living day to day. In other words, you can sit in your house, you can interact in your community, and if you live in a community fortunate not to directly experience these problems, you can pretend that they're not happening until they happen to you. In terms of alternatives, after delving deeply into nuclear technologies and the problems with them, that motivated me to buy my first solar panel in 1990, because I knew what I didn't like, and solar technology was becoming a little more mainstream. And I learned how to connect panels. I learned we need to figure out how to reduce our energy consumption to use solar, which is a issue with solar or anything else that is conveniently overlooked by a lot of the discussion. I learned the joys of solar. I learned its limitations. I learned you need a fuse in the system. I learned that one the hard way. Excuse me. So how we can learn to be much more efficient in our use of energy to get more use out of less input, that's part of what permaculture is also about. Permaculture was designed for an environment in Australia that gets almost no rainfall, 10 inches, 25 centimeters a year. So the original crafters of the permaculture concept were focused on how to create a yield agriculturally from a desert, where without being hyper efficient, you're not going to get anything. And they were also motivated by an awareness that peak oil was coming, that fossil fuels are not just polluting, but they're finite. And we'd better make best use of what remains in order to perhaps bridge to a future that can sustain us without them.
Sure. Speaking of peak oil, I know one of your heroes is M. King Hubbert, an American geologist and geophysicist who worked for Shell Oil Company, and his research and writing had a big effect on you. Tell us a little bit about M. King Hubbert.
Well, in my list of scientific heroes, M. King Hubbert is near the very top. He was a petroleum geologist who first figured out the math behind peak oil. He rose to fame in 1956 when he gave a presentation that predicted the United States would reach its peak of oil production in 1970. And at this time, we were finding more and more oil all over the world. And his colleagues in the industry said, no, there's no way that's true. Shut up, you don't know what you're talking about. And he was completely correct. the US peaked in oil production in 1970. He received widespread attention after the 1973 oil embargo and predicted that the world would peak around the turn of the century, which is pretty close to what happened. He predicted that even efficiency in our use of oil would not change things that much. And he also predicted that at first he thought nuclear power, since it's so concentrated, would be an adequate substitute. But by the mid-70s, he changed his mind. He came to feel solar power would be the replacement for petroleum. But if we learned to eliminate endless growth, in other words, solar could sustain a society that reached equilibrium, a steady state. It could not power endless growth on a finite planet. And now that we're seeing consequences of using petroleum and coal and nuclear to an extent, there's renewed interest in using solar as a substitute. But the other half of the requirement is that we have to control our needs. So today here in Oregon, it's not that sunny, it's been rainy, some places even are having snow, and it's not an ideal day for solar. So we have to learn to adapt our needs to what nature provides, not torture nature to meet our endless needs.
Sure. You mentioned one of the most basic principles of permaculture, efficiency. And even our own economic system claims that efficiency is a high ideal to get the most out of what you're doing. Even capitalism identifies with efficiency. And I think it's safe to say that our economic system is not very efficient in countless different ways. If you consider efficiency is what is the minimum you need to use to get the job done. So that leads to some important critical aspects of our society, and that is transportation and lifestyle and how we manage these needs going into the future. Given what you've said, given M. King Hubbert, given the news in the world today, what are your thoughts about the future of transportation?
Well, I've been concerned for decades that our massive uses of energy to move ourselves and to move all of our stuff in ways that previous generations couldn't have even imagined is going to come back to bite us.
It already is.
You and I, about 20 years ago, were involved in a successful effort to prevent a expressway in Eugene called the West Eugene Parkway. And part of my interest in working to stop that was it would have gone through rare and endangered habitat in a nature preserve. But the other reason, apart from the aesthetics and the morality of it, was it has been obvious that the rise and fall of petroleum would also see the rise and fall of endless automobility. In other words, we are planning for a future that may not be physically possible. And I've occasionally run into transportation planners and governments and their contractors who quietly admit, yes, you have a point. Because it takes a huge amount of energy to propel all of our cars and trucks and planes and trains and all the rest. It also requires an enormous amount of energy to build freeways, to maintain freeways. We have bridges coming to the end of their useful life. Here in Oregon, we're a seismic zone, so we have bridges that aren't designed for seismic concerns. And the entropy, the falling apart of all these structures means we can't even maintain what we've built. And yet we're still planning $1 trillion trillion, 1 trillion of new and expanded highways all over the United States. This is not a problem limited to the United States. They're building freeways all over the world in places that can afford them. And there's no thought for how the future is going to be. Now, we stopped the freeway, but we didn't change transportation policy in the area. So there are new and bigger highways continuing to be built. Oregon has recently built 3 new bypasses in the last decade, which got very little attention, pro or con. We have a 16 lane, that's not an exaggeration, widening of the Beltline Highway around Eugene. It would be 16 lanes at its widest. And when you ask the transportation planners how they square that with declining oil, they punt the question, or they say electric cars will solve everything. And electric cars require fossil fuels to make the cars, to mine the ore for the cars. And maintaining the roads isn't terribly much different with an electric car versus a regular car. And that's a whole separate concern from transportation versus public transit versus carpooling, car sharing, bicycles, urban design, and similar topics that you've covered elsewhere on your show. And I'm in agreement, but that's not the focus here.
Sure. Yeah. You have a ton of interesting information on your website. And years ago, one of the most impressive graphics that I saw that you researched and produced as a map, it was the highways, the divided highways that at some point in the 50s, 60s, maybe up to the 70s, that were receiving attention to actually build in Eugene. Some of them were, but a lot of them weren't. I was shocked to see back in the heyday of highway construction, all these highways that would have been built in Eugene that never were built in Eugene. So I have a great appreciation that although, as you say, $1 trillion for more highways, not everything was built. You've been involved with freeway fights in Washington, D.C. You keep track of that. There are highways that were never built in a lot of different places around the country. But electric cars don't make all of those problems go away. What's the issue? A lot of even people who are concerned about some of these problems say, we'll just run everything by electricity. How do you respond to that?
Well, where does the electricity come from? I mean, there's a great quote from the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, who said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And electricity is magic. It just appears from nowhere. You push a button and your device runs. It's invisible. You can't smell it, unlike gasoline at a gas station. You can't touch it. You can't use any of your normal senses. And yet there it is, and it does the most amazing work for us. In the United States, the #1 source of electricity is from burning natural gas, even more than anything else. And when you suggest this to advocates for, quote, electrification, the standard response is, oh, well, we want everything to run on renewables. And so do I. I've been using renewables for 32 years. But the idea of 100% renewable is conflated to mean we will run 100% of our current consumption, pun intended. There's no physical requirement that running everything on renewables is going to equal our current consumption of electricity. In other words, putting up a bunch of solar panels does not necessarily guarantee that's going to run everything that we're used to running. Here in the Northwest, there are regionally, we have a lot of dams, but we're on a Western power grid that's the western half of the United States and parts of Canada and Mexico. And there's more natural gas than hydroelectric on the Western power grid. We also locally, our peak electricity consumption is the coldest day of the year when all the heaters are on, and solar panels are not very when it's cold and snowy. In California, they have the opposite problem. Their peak electrical demand is when all the air conditioners are on the hottest day of the year, but solar panels are best around noontime, and California's peak is late afternoon on a hot day in July and August, and the solar is not as ideal for that. It's better, but it has its imperfections. And perhaps the biggest problem is that the electric grid is immensely complicated and requires all the generation to be balanced minute by minute, second by second, with the demand on the system. So if you're running your own house on solar, as I have done for a long time, there are times it works great and there are times you have to go without. But that doesn't work for a multinational power grid that runs all the critical infrastructure of our society. And that's a hard thing for people to grasp, that sometimes there's sunlight and wind and sometimes there's not. We're even at the point where dams are at risk of shutting down. The largest dam in California last summer shut down because they're having severe drought on a scale. And Oroville Dam shut down last August for a couple months until it snowed again in the Sierras. And this is a long-term problem. The dam, Hoover Dam near Las Vegas, is approaching low pool, dead pool, where they won't be able to run electricity anymore. It also may disrupt the flow of drinking water to Las Vegas, Nevada. So we are entering the era of consequences for bad choices and not looking ahead. And there are ways to mitigate this, but they involve changing the way we live, not just changing our technology.
Yeah, you made a comment. I've heard that our problems aren't so much technical. Our problems are more psychological. Our problems are more human related in terms of accepting the ideas that we can't continue consuming more and more energy and resources forever. And of course, that's what our economic system depends on.
Well, this fits into the famous paradigm of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross about the 5 stages of acceptance. We started denial. No, there's no problem. We're not having climate change. We're not having oil depletion. Then there's blame and scapegoating. Oh, it's just the fault of the oil companies. They're trying to profiteer. Or bargaining. Well, if we're going to run out of oil, we'll just find a quick substitute because my demand is important, and obviously there's an alternative waiting for us that will be a seamless substitute. We won't have to change too many things. Then there's depression, which is where a lot of people are at, and it's an easy one for all of us. Oh, there's nothing we can do. Things are screwed. And finally, acceptance. And the acceptance one is that we live on an abundant, finite planet, and collectively, as a civilization, we have to adapt our needs to what is there. And that's the hardest one to admit, because we've all grown up in a culture that does not believe in limits. There's a silly claim that I guess a few people have, that the earth is flat. It's not actually round, and that gets deserved ridicule as being ridiculous. But even more ridiculous is the idea that the Earth is constantly getting bigger. And that is the basis of our economic system, that there's always going to be more and more and more and more. And while we could extract more and more out of the Earth, it made a certain amount of sense, perhaps, but we've reached the limits of what's physically possible. So now that conventional oil is in decline, we're fracking, we're mining tar sands, which barely have a net energy positive return on investment, but we're doing that out of a sense of desperation. We're mining entire mountains just to get slivers of minerals when 50 years ago, it wouldn't have been worth our time to even bother with them.
Mark, you just passed over an important expression, energy in, energy out. I think most people don't really know what that means, and it's a critical phenomena. Explain a little bit more about energy invested in and what you get out of that.
Well, a good analogy is low-hanging fruit on a fruit tree. You have a bunch of fruit trees in your yard, and when they're ready, do you get out your fruit ladder and climb to the top of a fruit tree to pick your apple or whatever? Or do you just walk? You need to edit this. I'm going to cough. Sorry about that. Sorry for the glitch. Let me start again.
Okay.
You have a bunch of fruit trees in your beautiful permaculture garden. When the fruit is ready, do you go and walk by and pick the fruit that's easy to access? Or do you get out a ladder and go to the very top of the tree and retrieve the most difficult to access fruit? Most people pick the low-hanging fruit first. And this applies to oil, it applies to a fruit on a tree, it applies to lumber in a forest that we want to cut down to make something with. And it's just human nature in a way. We pick whatever's easiest. And with oil, the easiest to extract oil is gone. The easiest to extract coal and natural gas is gone. In California, in 1849, they discovered gold that was easy to extract with a pan in a creek. That is over, not because it was bad for our society or polluted creeks or displaced native people. It's because the easy to extract ore is gone, which is my nickname for our state. Ore is gone. And now to mine gold, they cut down whole mountains and run it through an intense process. In terms of oil, we used to get 100 units of energy out for every unit of energy to put in terms of the drilling and the pipeline or transportation, all the processes needed. And now we have 30 to 1, 10 to 1 with fracking and tar sands in Canada. It's barely net energy positive. We look at the impact of oil as how many dollars you have to spend, or euros or rubles or whatever. And that's a useful metric. But what matters most is how much energy is required to get it out of the ground. Maybe here's another analogy. If you had a car and the gas station was far away, but the gas station was offering gasoline for free, no money required, but your car only could hold enough gasoline to get halfway to the gas station, it wouldn't matter that the gasoline did not cost any money. Money is a symbol of energy exchange. It's not a substitute for energy exchange. This is a very alien concept for our society, but it's absolutely critical to understand thermodynamics the energy flows that keep everything running.
Yeah, yeah, that is a huge concept to understand, and it's critical. Just because we grew up with all the stuff we wanted doesn't guarantee that it's always going to be there. Let's pivot a little bit. There is in the international news, of course, the war in Ukraine. This has been going on for some time. Ukraine is a wealthy country. It has it produces immense amount of agriculture and has energy resources. And of course, we know that the protagonist of this problem is a country that many other countries depend on for their energy needs, puts a lot of people, a lot of entire nations, even the entire world in kind of a tough place with having a war against an enemy that you have to buy energy from. What's your take on the goings on in Ukraine within the larger geopolitical context?
Well, this is a quick moving situation, and where things will be tomorrow, next month, next year is anyone's guess. But it's been understood for many years, if not decades, that Russia's export of concentrated oil and gas, especially to Europe, has huge implications for international relations. So, for example, Germany is totally dependent on importing natural gas from Russia to keep its cities warm in the winter. Germany is cold climate. They don't have their own oil and gas supplies. It's minimal. It's one of the reasons they lost World War II is they didn't have their own energy supply. They had to grab it from nearby countries. And so they are being held hostage. There's a limit to what they can do to oppose Putin's Russia and support Ukraine militarily or even politically. Because without heating, a city like Berlin in the wintertime is going to be a very cold place. And you can read about the history of Berlin in World War II to see what happens to cities that where the plumbing freezes, to be blunt. This also applies to countries like Saudi Arabia, the world's largest producer of oil, of conventional oil, where their human rights abuses have been condemned by many, yet they make rush hour work in dozens of countries. Our food system is totally dependent on petroleum, aviation, military, etc. So he who has the oil can do whatever they want. Where does an 800-pound gorilla sit? Anywhere it wants. And oil and gas are not equally distributed around the world. They're in certain geological conditions. And those who have their hand on the spigot can wield immense power, not just financial power, but military power, political power, other forms of power. And now that we're passing peak oil everywhere, some places faster than others, we're entering a game of musical chairs on a global scale. One of the reasons Putin thought he could get away with attacking Ukraine is the dependence of Western Europe on the oil and gas exports from Russia. And some of the smaller countries are making more noise about discontinuing those, but it's going to be very difficult for Germany and a couple of the other countries to do that. The latest news is that the European Union is saying, we're going to stop importing coal from Russia, but that's a lot easier than to stop importing oil and gas.
Let's pivot just a little bit.
Oh, can I just add one thing about Germany? They have put up a lot of solar panels in recent years and a lot of wind farms. And it's commendable. And they're working very hard to make that more practical. But again, solar works more in the summer than the winter. And wind power is more practical for the whole year, but it's highly variable. Sometimes it's windy, sometimes it's not. And you can't run an electric grid on a large scale solely on variable sources if you want it to stay on all the time.
Sure. Let's move a little more into the economics and the sociology. Humans have lots of reasons to rethink their values, priorities, and goals based on our conversation. And of course, people have written books about what we're talking about, saying basically that we can't keep doing what we're doing. For our entire lives, we've been told capitalism and its growth-based consumer culture is the best way to organize society. We championed the idea that communism and socialism didn't work out. They're not all that really different from capitalism in the terms that they require growth and they put humans at the top of everything. But we're told that capitalism and democracy go hand in hand, that they're made for each other. And our system is predicated on the idea that people believe these theories and these ideas. We've been taught these ever since we've been in school. This is part of our culture. So reflecting on our conversation, how would you suggest moving into a preferred future?
A short answer is we need to understand limits to growth on an abundant and finite planet. We need to understand that there have been no shortage of warnings that we're headed off a cliff and that we've chosen to disregard nearly all of them. The limits to growth study in 1972 predicted that we would reach overshoot around the turn of the century, and even doubling the amount of resources available would not change the shape of the curve very much. There's no shortage of warnings about climate change, and now it's here, and climate activism has had very little, if any, reduction of consumption. The only things that have reduced consumption have been the physical inability to extract something, recession, and now COVID closures cut energy consumption in the US almost 10% in 2020, not because we decided we wanted to, but because things shut down to try to mitigate the pandemic. And now that people think the pandemic is over, even though it's not, energy consumption has come back up. Transportation took a huge nosedive in March of 2020 because things shut down. Not because we decided, oh, we're going to all ride our bicycles or take public transit. In fact, public transit systems all over the country and other countries are having financial crises because of COVID and people not wanting to take the subway with each other and possibly get sick from their fellow passengers. On a philosophical level, there's a false dichotomy that it's either capitalism or socialism, when, as you say, both are industrial ways of looking at the world. I like Martin Luther King's observation towards the end of his life that we need to look beyond both capitalism and communism, that capitalism forgets life is social and communism forgets life as individual, and we need a higher synthesis that combines the truths of both. And this is not part of our binary view of the world. It's looking more at nuance and subtlety and interconnection. How do we use our creative talents that we've developed through scientific exploration, communication, education, to meet our actual needs as opposed to frivolous needs that we might like, but if we weren't doing, there's no shortage of stuff we could abandon and live better using less without, I mean, why billionaires need more billions is not something I understand. And why in the wealthiest country in the world, in our history as a species, we have people sleeping in the streets because there's not a roof over their head, makes no sense either. We can avoid both scenarios. This is not about leveling everybody into a state of poverty. It's more, how do we use our resources in ways that benefit life and not greed and destruction? And we all know this to some extent, and different people have different opinions on how to make this happen. But what is physically available ultimately matters more than ideology of any kind. And this is not something to say, oh, the Democrats are better than the Republicans or something like that. This is a top to bottom transformation of civilization that we're in many ways afraid to address, because this would require admitting that our tremendous technical abilities have forgotten the ability to cooperate and address the actual needs that we have.
Right, this goes back to the comment we noted earlier about the biggest challenges are psychological and social rather than technical. And the idea that what is the goal in a civilization? We have our elections and we call this a democracy. You can vote essentially for Republicans or Democrats, and no other party or group really has much of a chance because it's pretty much monopolized. But I would really like to see something of a widespread civic discussion is what's the goal of a society, what it is, what's the purpose of what we're doing. And of course, the consumer culture likes to fill in that blank with having more stuff. He or she who dies with the most stuff wins. Well, a lot of people are dying because they've got too much stuff. So I think it's really important to not be critical in a bitter way, but be critical in a way that leads to elevating our thoughts and appreciating what the choices we do have, because we do know here and there all over the world, people are creating a preferred future. People are creating alternatives to the economic system as we know it. I find that very heartening. And I know you have experience out there on your own place. You have a windmill, you have solar panels, and you grow a useful amount of your own food. Of course, in me doing my permaculture property, this isn't the complete answer, but it's certainly pointing in a healthy direction.
But the scale of what we need is not just the household level shift or even neighborhood. The whole civilization needs to be doing this. It has the resources we spend on war and domination are the resources we would need to survive the giant mess we've made on every level. And that, for me, was one of the hopes of the pandemic, is that the obvious need to cooperate to mitigate the problem could be seen as an example of how to shift in ways to promote public health, not just on diseases, but 6 weeks of military spending could solve most of the waterborne disease in the world. We wiped out smallpox in the 1970s from the earth. for the cost of one, less than one B-1 bomber. We know how to do a lot, and we could spend the rest of our lives talking about all of these things. And doing that would make us safer, happier, healthier, more secure in every way possible. And it might make it more likely that future generations are going to have a chance to live and thrive. I mean, one of the great tragedies in Ukraine right now is the destruction of their cities, whether that will even be rebuilt or not. But even if it is rebuilt, what a waste. What a waste of people's talents and time and money and physical